The fluorescent lights of the administrative wing were a surgical white, far more clinical than the warm, yellowed glow of the ICU where Uchechi Joseph spent her 12-hour shifts. She stood on the plush carpet of the executive suite, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The posture of a woman who had spent years learning how to occupy as little space as possible. Across the mahogany desk, Patricia Vaughn, the CEO of City Central, didn't look up from her tablet. The efficiency metrics for the 4th floor are down again, Joseph, Vaughn said, her voice a sharp instrument. She flicked a manicured finger across the screen. You're meticulous, I'll give you that. Your charts are perfect. But you spend too much time talking to the patients. This is a hospital, not a social club. We need throughput. I was stabilizing Mr. Henderson's blood pressure, ma'am, Uchechi said softly, her voice carrying the melodic lilt of her Nigerian heritage, softened by years in the American South. He's a veteran. He gets agitated when the monitor. He's a line item. Joseph. Just like the gauze and the saline, Vaughn interrupted, finally looking up. Her eyes were cold, scanning Uchechi with the casual dismissal one might reserve for a piece of functional furniture. You're a good nurse, but you lack the corporate vision for leadership. Try to focus on the clock, not the conversation. You're dismissed. Uchechi nodded once, a quick, jerky motion that Vaughn likely took for submissiveness. Yes, ma'am. Sorry. Ma'am. As Uchechi turned to leave, her eyes didn't settle on the expensive art or the glass trophies. Instead, they traced the hinges of the heavy oak door. Solid core. Steel frame. Swing in. One kick to the primary bolt would hold it, but the glass sidelight is a structural vulnerability. She walked toward the elevators, her gait rhythmic and silent, to the residents hurrying past with their stethoscopes like badges of nobility. She was just a black nurse, the one who worked the graveyard shifts and never complained about the broken ice machines. They didn't see the way her pupils dilated as she passed the fire exit. They didn't notice that her mind was automatically overlaying a tactical grid onto the hospital's blueprints. Sector 1, the lobby. Too much glass. A kill zone with no cover. Sector 2, the service hallways. Low ceilings. Tight corners. Ideal for slicing the pie. She reached into her scrub pocket, her fingers brushing the serrated edge of her Delta Force Challenge coin. It was cold, a piece of heavy metal that felt like an anchor in a world that wanted her to drift. She remembered the heat of Timbuktu, the smell of burnt ozone, and the way the sand had turned to glass under the heat of the explosions. She had been Ogun there, the Yoruba god of iron and war. Here, she was just Uchechi, the woman who brought extra blankets to the lonely men in bed for. She stopped at the vending machine in the staff lounge, not because she was hungry, but because it sat at a 45-degree angle to the main ICU entrance. It provided a clear line of sight to the elevators while obscuring her silhouette. Hey, Joseph. You're staring again, a young intern called out, laughing as he grabbed a soda. Thinking about that paperwork Vaughn chewed you out for? Uchechi forced a small, shy smile. Something like that, doctor. She watched him walk away, noticing the way his white coat caught on the corner of the nurse's station, a snag point. Her mind continued to catalog the environment with the detached coldness of a computer. The heavy oxygen tanks that could become shrapnel. The narrowness of the recovery ward that funneled movement into a fatal funnel, and the way the security cameras had a 4-second lag on the refresh. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a ghost in a sterile machine, waiting for a ghost she hoped would never come. She knew the hospital wasn't a sanctuary, it was a fortress with cardboard walls. And as she headed back to the ICU, her hands, the same hands that could stitch a femoral artery in the dark, were perfectly, terrifyingly still. The ICU was a cathedral of low-frequency hums and rhythmic clicks. A place where time didn't move in minutes, but in the steady drip of 4 bags. Uchechi stepped behind the nurse's station, the weight of the CEO's dismissal still sitting like a film on her skin. She didn't let it show. She simply reached for the chart for bed 4. The newest intake from a supposed high-speed collision on I-95. His name on the chart was John Doe, though the paperwork had been updated an hour ago to Malik Turner. The diagnosis was a grade 3 concussion, 2 broken ribs, and a deep laceration to the thigh. To the paramedics, he was a victim of physics and bad luck. To the surgical residents, he was an interesting suture project. But as Uchechi approached the curtain of bed 4, her internal Ogun radar, the one she had tried so hard to dismantle, began to ping. She pulled the curtain aside. The man in the bed was large, his frame stretching the limits of the hospital gown, but it wasn't his size that stopped her. It was his stillness. Most trauma patients were restless, their bodies twitching with the lingering adrenaline of the accident or the haze of pain medication. Malik Turner lay perfectly flat, his hands resting on top of the sheets, palms down. His breathing was shallow, controlled, and entirely too deliberate for a man who had supposedly hit a concrete barrier at 70 miles per hour. "Time for your vitals, Mr. Turner," Uchechi said, her voice a soft, practiced neutral. He didn't jump. He didn't even turn his head quickly. He simply opened his eyes. Uchechi froze for a fraction of a second, the blood pressure cuff hanging limp in her hand. It was the stare. It wasn't the vacant look of a concussion victim or the pleading gaze of the wounded. It was the 1,000-yard stare she had seen in the mirrors in Timbuktu, a predatory, hyper-aware scanning of the room that looked for exits before it looked for faces. It was the look of a man who was counting the seconds until the world exploded. "You're not supposed to be awake yet," she whispered, leaning over him to check his pupillary response. "The sedative didn't take," he rasped. His voice was a dry rattle, but the clarity behind it was terrifying. His eyes tracked her hands, not with curiosity, but with a calculation of threat. He saw her calloused knuckles. He saw the way she didn't flinch when a cart slammed in the hallway. "You're a Fed," she murmured, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She saw the minute tightening of his jaw, the tell of a man whose cover had just been blown by a woman he thought was just a nurse. "Get out of here, Uchechi," he whispered, reading her name tag. The accident wasn't an accident. They're coming to finish it. Uchechi didn't argue. She didn't ask who they were. She simply reached down, pretending to adjust his foreline, and felt the distinct, hard ridge of a tactical tracking device taped to the underside of the bed frame. It wasn't a hospital tag. It was a beacon. "I can't leave my floor," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its civilian softness. She looked him dead in the eye. And for the first time in 3 years, she didn't hide the steel in her own gaze. "And you can't run with that leg." The man, Agent Malik Turner, blinked, his calculated aggression momentarily faltering as he realized he wasn't looking at a civilian. He saw the shift in her posture, the way her center of gravity lowered, and the absolute lack of fear in her pupils. "Delta," he breathed, the word barely a ghost of a sound. Uchechi didn't answer. She reached into her pocket and gripped her challenge coin, the cold metal grounding her. Outside, the elevator chimed. It was a normal sound, a sound she heard 50 times a night. But her ears, trained to distinguish the rustle of a ghillie suit from the wind in the Sahel, picked up something else, the heavy, synchronized footfalls of 4 men who weren't wearing rubber-soled hospital shoes. She looked at Malik, then at the heavy swinging doors of the ICU. The rookie was gone. The nurse was still there, but she was no longer alone in Uchechi's skin. The storm had arrived, and for the first time since the long walk, Ogun was ready to answer. Uchechi left Malik's bedside with a gait that looked casual to the untrained eye, but was in reality a disciplined low-signature prowl. Every step was a calculation of sound and surface. She reached the ICU's main nursing station, where the central security monitor flickered with the jagged, unstable feed of 12 different camera angles. She leaned over the desk, her eyes darting across the screens. What she saw made the ghost of Ogun roar with a familiar, cold fury. On screen 4, the main lobby's maglock doors, supposedly reinforced with industrial-grade electromagnetic bolts, were standing wide open. There was no sign of a struggle. No shattered glass. The locks simply hadn't engaged. Vaughn's cost-saving measures had replaced the high-tension security system with a cheaper, software-based alternative that had crashed 3 times in the last month. Tonight, it had finally flatlined. Uchechi's gaze shifted to screen 7, which covered the north stairwell. A man in a dark tactical vest was holding the door open for 3 others. They moved with a paramilitary rhythm, not the tight, surgical precision of Delta, but the aggressive, sweeping confidence of cartel enforcers. They weren't hiding. They knew the broken line of the hospital's security meant they owned the hallways. "Where's Miller?" Uchechi asked, her voice startling Denise, the night shift charge nurse who was busy filing requisition forms. "The security guard? Probably in the basement getting more coffee." Denise sighed, not looking up. "He said the monitors were glitching again." "Why?" Uchechi didn't answer. She was looking at the monitor for the service elevator. The red light was active. They were bypassing the public elevators and taking the spine of the building straight to the ICU. She realized then that the paperwork error Vaughn had screamed about earlier, the missing inventory of trauma supplies, wasn't a mistake. Vaughn had diverted the security maintenance budget to pay for the lobby's new marble waterfall, leaving the hospital's digital veins open to any parasite with a gun. "Denise, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Uchechi said. The tone was no longer that of the apologetic rookie. It was a command, vibrating with a frequency that made Denise drop her pen. "Lock the medication room from the inside. Do not come out until you hear me say your middle name. Do it now." "Uchechi, what are you?" "Now." The word was a whip crack. Denise scrambled backward, eyes wide, seeing for the first time that the quiet nurse she'd bullied was gone. In her place stood a woman whose presence seemed to expand, filling the cramped station with a sudden, lethal gravity. Uchechi turned back to the monitors. The intruders were 2 floors away. She looked at the heavy double doors of the ICU, the front door of her sanctuary. She knew the magnetic locks there were just as useless as the ones in the lobby. She reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy-duty blood pressure cuff and a roll of industrial surgical tape. In her mind, the floor plan of the ICU transformed. It was no longer a place of healing. It was a fatal funnel. The long, sterile corridor was a shooting gallery, and the only cover was the reinforced desk. She looked at the fire suppression system overhead. Dry chemical, triggered by heat or manual override. She reached into her pocket and squeezed the challenge coin until the metal bit into her palm. The cartel expected a soft target, a terrified staff, a helpless witness, and a dying agent. They expected the broken line to lead them straight to their prize. They had no idea that the line hadn't broken. It had simply shifted. Uchechi Joseph was no longer guarding a hospital. She was defending a perimeter. She stepped into the center of the hallway, the red strobe of a system malfunction light reflecting off her dark skin, and waited for the sound of the elevator doors to hiss open. The transition was complete. The nurse was under anesthesia. The medic was on the line. The silence of the hospital corridor began to stretch, warping into a different kind of quiet. The oppressive, baking heat of the Sahel. In the seconds before the elevator doors could reveal the threat, Uchechi wasn't in Boston anymore. She was back in the red dust of Mali, 2017, where the air tasted like copper and diesel. The long walk was what they called the final phase of selection, but for Uchechi, the Real walk began after the Black Hawk went down. They had been interdicting a high-level courier near the Niger border when the world turned upside down. One moment, the rotors were a rhythmic lullaby. The next, a shoulder-fired missile had turned their bird into a falling star. Uchechi remembered the impact, a bone-shaking shudder that felt like being hit by a freight train. She had crawled from the burning fuselage, her medic bag gripped in a white-knuckled fist. The sand was 120 degrees, and the horizon was a shimmering blur of enemies closing in. Her team, men she had bled with, men who called her Ogun because she could knit a shattered body back together under fire, were scattered across the dunes like broken toys. She had dragged Miller to a depression in the sand, his legs gone, his eyes already glazing. She had used every tourniquet in her kit, her hands moving with a clinical, terrifying speed while bullets kicked up plumes of dust inches from her head. Then came Elias. Then Henderson. She had worked until her fingernails were torn and her scrubs, then a desert tan, were soaked dark. "Leave us, Ogun," Elias had whispered, pressing his unit challenge coin into her palm. "You're the only one who can make the distance. Go." She hadn't wanted to go. A medic's soul is tied to the heartbeats of their team. But the mission profile was absolute, and the intel they carried was worth more than their lives. She had stood up, tucked the coin into her pocket, and begun the 40-mile trek through the green zone that was anything but green. She had walked for 3 days without water, moving like a ghost through the acacia scrub, dodging patrols by inches, her mind fractured by the screams she had left behind. When the extraction bird finally found her, she was a skeleton wrapped in burnt skin, still clutching her medical kit. She was the sole survivor, the ghost of Timbuktu. The army gave her a medal and a discharge, but they couldn't take back the silence. They couldn't erase the feeling that she had traded her team's lives for her own. The chime of the ICU elevator snapped the memory like a dry branch. The heat of the desert vanished, replaced by the artificial chill of the hospital. Uchechi felt the weight of the coin in her pocket, no longer a burden of guilt, but a reservoir of strength. The men coming through those doors weren't the first monsters she had faced, and they wouldn't be the last. She had survived the long walk. She had survived the fire. As the elevator doors slid open, revealing the silhouettes of the cartel enforcers, Yuchechi's heart rate didn't spike. It leveled out into a steady, combat-ready rhythm. The Timbuktu ghost had finally stopped running. She was home, she was Ogun, and this ward was her sand. The chime of the elevator was the last sound of the world where Yuchechi Joseph was an invisible nurse. As the doors hissed open at exactly 2 o'clock hours, the atmosphere in the ICU shifted, the air pressure dropping as if a storm front had finally broken. Diego Morales stepped out first. He wasn't wearing a mask. He didn't feel he needed one in a house of the dying. He was draped in dark tactical gear that looked expensive but lacked the wear and tear of a true operator. He carried a suppressed submachine gun with the casual arrogance of a man who had never met a target that could hit back. Behind him, 3 enforcers fanned out, their boots heavy and loud on the linoleum, their weapons sweeping the room with undisciplined aggression. "Clear the desks," Morales barked, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. "Find Turner. Anyone moves, they stay here forever." From behind the nursing station, Yuchechi watched them through the narrow gap between a stack of patient files and a computer monitor. Her pulse, which usually fluttered when the CEO raised her voice, was now a slow, subterranean thrum, exactly 60 beats per minute. The rookie who struggled with the digital charting system was gone, suppressed as deeply as the muzzle of Morales's weapon. In her place was a Tier 1 combat medic who saw not men, but tactical problems to be solved. She didn't reach for a gun. She reached for the environment. The lead enforcer, a muscular man with a jagged scar across his temple, kicked open the door to the break room. He expected a huddle of weeping staff. Instead, he found a darkened room and a sudden, sharp hiss. Yuchechi had pre-staged a high-pressure fire extinguisher near the door. As he entered, she didn't just spray it. She used the heavy canister as a blunt force instrument, swinging it in a compact arc that utilized her core strength. The metal smashed into the side of his tactical helmet, the vibration traveling up her arms, a familiar, grounding sensation of impact. Before he could cry out, she jammed her thumb into the soft tissue beneath his jaw, a Tier 1 pressure point that shut down his nervous system in a heartbeat. He collapsed into the shadows without a sound. 1 down, 3 to go. Morales reached the center of the ward, frustrated by the silence. "Hector? Report." Yuchechi moved through the darkened hallway like smoke, her soft-soled nursing shoes finally serving a tactical purpose. She wasn't running, she was ghosting, utilizing the shadows created by the flickering system malfunction lights. She passed the supply closet, her hand snatching a heavy liter of saline and a roll of trauma tape. The second enforcer was near bed too, his back to the medication room. Yuchechi didn't hesitate. She didn't feel the monster she had feared. She felt the medic, the one who knew exactly where the carotid artery sat and how much pressure it took to put a man to sleep. She lunged, her movement a blur of blue scrubs and dark skin. She looped the saline bag's plastic tubing around his throat, using the weight of the liter bag as a counterlever. It was a move born in the dirt of the Sahel, refined for the corridors of a hospital. He thrashed for 3 seconds before his eyes rolled back, and he slumped against the heart monitor. The machine let out a single, sharp beep as his shoulder hit the alarm button. Morales spun around, his weapon raised. "Who's there?" He saw a flash of a blue uniform disappearing behind a surgical curtain. He fired a burst. The suppressed rounds thwip-thwiping through the fabric, shredding a pillow and a plastic pitcher of water. Yuchechi was already gone, flattened against the floor, sliding under the gap of a gurney. She could hear Morales's breathing now, heavy, ragged, and untrained. He was losing his composure because the soft target was hitting back from the dark. "I know you're in here, nurse." Morales screamed, his bravado cracking. Yuchechi remained silent. She was 3 feet away from him, hidden by the shadows of the heavy oxygen tanks she had mapped out an hour ago. She felt the challenge coin in her pocket, the cold iron of Ogun. The rookie nurse had vanished, and in the 2 o'clock darkness of the ICU, the predator had become the prey. The ICU was no longer a ward. It was a dark, pressurized chamber where the only sound was the jagged breathing of a hunter who didn't realize he had become the prey. Morales stood near the central hub, his weapon trembling slightly as he swept the darkness. He was looking for a nurse. He wasn't looking for a ghost. Yuchechi moved through the shadows of the West Wing, her silhouette invisible against the dark equipment. She reached the medication prep room where Denise and two younger nursing students were huddled under a stainless steel table. Their fear was a physical presence, a frantic energy that threatened to shatter the silence. Denise's eyes were wide, brimming with tears, her mouth opening to let out a sob that would bring Morales' submachine gun fire through the thin drywall. Before a sound could escape, Yuchechi was there. She didn't speak. Speaking was a luxury of the safe. Instead, she raised her left hand, palm flat and facing them, the universal tactical signal for freeze. Her eyes, usually soft and averted in the presence of the CEO, were now two chips of obsidian, commanding and absolute. The nurses froze. Yuchechi then pointed two fingers at her own eyes and then toward the back exit. "Watch me." She signaled a closed fist, then slowly opened it into a pointing gesture toward the floor. "Stay low." There was a shifting of boots in the hallway. Morales was moving closer. Yuchechi didn't flinch. She reached out and grabbed Denise's hand, pressing the woman's fingers against the cold metal of a medical cart. She leaned in, her breath barely touching Denise's ear. "The loading dock," Yuchechi mouthed, the words silent. "Go. Now." She stepped into the hallway first to clear the corner, using the edge of a heavy crash cart as a mobile shield. She peered toward the elevators. The third enforcer was standing guard there, his back to the service exit. Yuchechi didn't have a flashbang, but she had a pressurized canister of medical-grade CO2 and a rolling four-pole. She signaled the nurses to move behind her. As they crawled toward the service door, Yuchechi calculated the distance. With a sharp, sudden motion, she shoved the four-pole toward the far end of the hallway. The metal clattered against a trash bin, a deliberate distraction pebble. The enforcer spun toward the noise, his weapon raised. In that split second of diverted attention, Yuchechi ushered the women through the heavy fire doors leading to the loading dock. She stayed in the threshold, her body a barrier between the terrified civilians and the men with guns. Denise looked back, her face a mask of shock, finally seeing the invisible nurse for what she truly was, a shepherd in the valley of the shadow of death. Yuchechi gave one final signal, a flat hand cutting across her throat, then a thumb pointing toward the exterior gates. Extraction. "Get out." As the heavy doors clicked shut, locking the nurses in the safety of the loading bay, Yuchechi turned back to the darkened ICU. The triage was complete. The innocent were clear. The broken line had held just long enough to save the many, but now, the line had to contract. There was still a man in bed for who couldn't walk, and a cartel leader who still thought he was the most dangerous thing in the building. She reached into her pocket, felt the serrated edge of the challenge coin, and let out a long, slow breath. The medic had done her job. Now it was time for Ogun to finish hers. The nurses were safe, the heavy loading dock doors clicking shut with a finality that left Yuchechi alone in the dark. She stood in the transition corridor, her breathing deep and rhythmic, the box breathing of an operator preparing for contact. She didn't have a rifle or a plate carrier, but she had something the men in the hallway lacked: total environmental mastery. She moved back into the ICU, performing a maneuver known in the Tier 1 community as slicing the pie. As she approached the corner leading to the central nursing hub, she didn't just round it, she moved in incremental, microscopic inches, her eyes scanning the new sliver of the room revealed with every step. Her center of gravity was low, her scrubs silent. The third enforcer was near the crash cart, his back to a large, decorative pillar. He was agitated, his weapon jerking toward every shadow. Yuchechi didn't rush him. She reached for the heavy life-pack defibrillator, sitting on its charging base. She didn't intend to shock him. Not yet. She unplugged the unit, coiled the thick black cables around her wrists like combat wraps, and gripped the hard plastic paddles. She kicked a metal kidney basin across the floor. The clatter was a physical lure. The enforcer spun, his muzzle flash lighting up the dark for a fraction of a second as he fired a panicked burst into a stack of pillows. In that moment of muzzle blindness, Yuchechi moved. She didn't run, she exploded forward in a straight line. She hit him low, her shoulder driving into his solar plexus to knock the wind from his lungs. As he gasped, she brought the heavy edge of the defibrillator paddle down on his wrist. The bone snapped with a dry crack, and his submachine gun clattered to the floor. Before he could scream, she pressed the second paddle against his temple, not to deliver a charge, but as a weighted blunt force instrument. One precise, clinical strike to the temple sent him into instant neurogenic shock. He collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. She didn't stop to admire the work. She retrieved his weapon, dropped the magazine, and cleared the chamber in one fluid motion. She didn't want the gun. She wanted the silence. She tossed the useless metal into a biohazard bin and turned her attention back to the hub. Morales was the only one left. He was standing near bed 4. His shadow stretched long by the red emergency strobe. He was holding a handgun to the head of Agent Malik Turner. "Come out, nurse." Morales screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched frantic edge. "I know you're not just some girl from the night shift. I see what you did to my men." Uchechi stepped into the light. She didn't hide. She walked down the center of the hallway, her hands empty and visible, her face a mask of terrifying clinical calm. She looked like a surgeon walking into a theater, detached and focused. "You're right, Diego," she said, her voice echoing with the authority of a commanding officer. "I'm not just a nurse. I'm the person who knows exactly how much pressure it takes to collapse a windpipe, and exactly how long you'll bleed out if I hit the femoral. You're in my ward now." She continued her slow, predatory advance, slicing the distance between them. Every step was measured. She wasn't just approaching a gunman, she was performing a procedure. She was Ogun, and the ICU had become her operating table. Morales's finger tightened on the trigger, his eyes darting between Uchechi and the wounded agent. He was a professional killer, but he was looking into the eyes of a woman who had walked through the fires of Timbuktu and come out made of iron. For the first time that night, the man with the gun was the one who was truly afraid. The heavy double doors of the ICU didn't just open, they were breached. The silence that had followed Uchechi's clinical dismantling of the cartel unit was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots and the blinding sweep of weapon-mounted lights. "Police! Drop the weapon! Hands in the air!" The shouts came from a dozen directions at once as a SWAT stack flooded the ward. Diego Morales was already on the floor, his face pressed into the linoleum, his spirit broken long before the police arrived. He didn't even flinch when the zip ties bit into his wrists. He just kept staring at Uchechi, who stood in the center of the hallway, her scrubs stained with saline and dust, her hands open and empty. Commander Isaiah Grant pushed through the line of his officers, his rifle lowered but his eyes sharp, scanning for the threat. He saw the downed enforcers, one neutralized by a fire extinguisher, another by a saline bag garrote, and the third slumped near the defibrillator. He saw the surprised look frozen on the face of the man Uchechi had taken down last, a man who had clearly expected a victim and found a nightmare. Grant's gaze finally settled on the tall, dark-skinned nurse standing over the wounded federal agent. He started to bark an order for her to step away, but as he got closer, his voice died in his throat. He saw the way she stood, the slight bend in the knees, the weight distributed perfectly for a pivot. The eyes that didn't squint against the tactical lights but absorbed them with a terrifying, calm focus. He recognized that stance. He had seen it in the jagged mountains of Afghanistan and the sun-bleached streets of Djibouti. "Ogun," Grant whispered, the name slipping out like a prayer. Uchechi's gaze shifted to him. For a moment, the mask of the Tier 1 operator remained, cold and impenetrable. Then, she saw the patch on Grant's shoulder, the same Joint Special Operations Command insignia she had worn a lifetime ago. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, a weary, human expression that finally brought the nurse back into her eyes. "Commander," she said, her voice a soft rasp. "Patient in bed 4 has a grade 3 concussion and a femoral laceration. He needs a surgical team, not a tactical one. Clear the floor." Grant didn't argue. He didn't ask how a rookie nurse had neutralized a cartel hit squad. He turned to his men, his voice booming with a new kind of authority. "Secure the perimeter. Medic, get a gurney over here. This woman just saved a federal asset." As the SWAT team moved to comply, Grant did something that made the remaining hospital staff, including a trembling Patricia Vaughn who had just appeared in the doorway, freeze in disbelief. The commander of the city's elite tactical unit snapped his heels together. He brought his hand up to his brow in a crisp, sharp, and deeply respectful salute. "It's an honor." "Senior Chief," Grant said, his voice thick with a warrior's recognition. "We heard the stories about Timbuktu. We didn't know you were here." Uchechi looked at him, then at her own hands. They were steady now, no longer balled into fists but ready to heal. She felt the challenge coin in her pocket, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a key. Across the room, the veterans who had been hiding in the recovery ward, men who had seen Uchechi use the hand signals of their own youth, began to stand. One by one, they mirrored Grant's gesture. From the old Marine in bed 6 to the young corporal in the hallway, a silent salute of the elite rippled through the ward. Uchechi Joseph, the invisible nurse, stood in the center of the tribute. She didn't return the salute. She simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that never truly breaks. She wasn't just a ghost anymore. She was a bridge. And as the sirens wailed in the distance, she finally felt the last of the Sahel dust wash away, replaced by the cool, clear air of home. The morning sun didn't just rise over the city. It reclaimed the hospital, burning away the long shadows of the night shift. In the executive boardroom, the atmosphere was far from the sterile quiet of the ICU. Patricia Vaughn sat at the head of the mahogany table, her knuckles white as she gripped a legal pad. Across from her sat the board of directors and a silent, stony-faced commander, Isaiah Grant. The corporate vision Vaughn had championed was laid bare on the table in the form of a forensic audit and a stack of tactical reports. The faulty maglocks, the diverted security funds, and the paperwork errors that were actually desperate pleas for life-saving equipment were no longer hidden in spreadsheets. They were evidence. The hospital requires a leader who understands that a trauma center is a sanctuary, not a profit center, the board chairman said, his voice cold. Your resignation is effective immediately, Patricia. We have already appointed an interim director of trauma operations. Vaughn looked toward the door, expecting a suit, a man with an MBA and a firm handshake. Instead, the door opened to reveal Uchechi Joseph. She was no longer wearing the faded, oversized scrubs of an apologetic rookie. She wore a crisp, dark navy uniform, her posture straight, her presence commanding the room with a gravity that made the high-backed chairs seem small. She didn't look at Vaughn. She looked at the blueprints of the hospital spread out on the table. First order of business, Uchechi said, her voice steady and resonant. We are gutting the lobby waterfall. That space is being converted into a rapid response triage bay. And the security contract? It's being handed to the men and women who actually know how to hold a line. 6 months later, the smell of City Central had changed. It still had the sharp tang of antiseptic, but now it was laced with the scent of strong, dark coffee and the low, rumbling laughter of men who had spent too long in the silence. Uchechi stood in the doorway of what used to be a storage wing. Above the door, a simple wooden sign read, "The Bridge Program." It wasn't a clinic, and it wasn't a barracks. It was a space where the ghosts could finally take off their masks. Inside, Agent Malik Turner, now walking with a cane but with a clear, focused light in his eyes, was sitting with a group of young veterans and hospital staff. They weren't just talking about trauma. They were learning how to translate the skills of the battlefield into the halls of medicine. Uchechi watched as a young medic, fresh out of a tour in the Middle East and struggling to adapt to civilian nursing, sat down with a retired master sergeant. She saw the moment the connection happened, the shared language of the long walk, the silent understanding of the burden of the medic. Uchechi reached into her pocket and felt the challenge coin. For years, it had been a reminder of what she had lost. Now it was a symbol of what she had built. She realized that she hadn't just saved the hospital that night, she had saved herself. She was no longer a ghost of the Sahel or a shadow in the ICU. She was the architect of a new kind of peace. As the afternoon sun cast long, golden rectangles across the floor of the bridge, Uchechi felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Denise, the charge nurse who had once looked down on her, now serving as the program's lead coordinator. The new intake is ready for their orientation, Director, Denise said, her voice full of genuine warmth. Uchechi nodded, a small, confident smile playing on her lips. She took a breath, not the sharp, tactical inhale of a soldier entering a kill zone, but the deep, peaceful breath of a woman who was exactly where she was meant to be. The uniform comes off, but the warrior never does. They just find a different way to fight for the people beside them. Uchechi Joseph had finally finished her long walk. She was Ogun, she was a nurse. And for the first time in a very long time, she was home.